From compensation clarity to agency clarity. In the previous section, we focused on the importance of clearly defining compensation through written agreements at the beginning of the relationship. That conversation naturally leads us to the next critical step in professional practice, clearly defining agency and understanding the fiduciary duties that come with it. Just as compensation should never be assumed, agency should never be left unclear. In today's market, where conversations happen quickly and relationships can form in minutes, the risk is not usually intentional misconduct. It is misunderstanding. Professional agents prevent that risk by establishing both compensation and agency at the very start of every client interaction. The story. When a simple conversation becomes something more. Imagine sitting down with a potential seller during a listing presentation. The conversation starts casually, but quickly becomes detailed. The seller shares why they are moving, how soon they need to sell, and even hints at the lowest price they would accept. You listen, provide feedback, and offer suggestions on pricing and strategy. The meeting feels productive and professional. A few days later, you find out the seller listed with another brokerage. Now you are left thinking about everything that was shared during that meeting. The question becomes, was that just a conversation, or did it begin to feel like representation? Understanding agency through actions, not just agreements. Agency relationships are most commonly created through written agreements, but they can also arise from conduct. If a client reasonably believes you are acting in their best interest based on your actions, there is a risk that an agency relationship could be implied. In modern practice, a listing presentation alone does not typically create agency because there is no mutual agreement to enter into that relationship. However, when an agent begins offering detailed advice, strategy, or guidance without clearly defining their role, the lines can begin to blur. This is why professional agents take a moment at the beginning of every interaction to clearly explain their role and when representation begins. That one step ties directly back to the previous section. Just as you define compensation up front, you must also define agency up front. The professional approach, setting expectations. Early. A skilled agent will start a listing presentation by explaining that no agency relationship exists until a listing agreement is signed. This creates clarity, protects the agent, and helps the client understand the structure of the relationship. Even without a formal agreement, professionalism still applies. Information shared during these early conversations should be treated with care. Clients may not always understand agency law, but they always understand trust. The story, pricing pressure, and the role of the listing agent. Now consider a seller who insists on listing their property above market value. You have provided comparable sales, explained current conditions, and advised a realistic price, but the seller is firm. A buyer becomes interested and begins asking questions about value. They reference market data and appear uncertain about the price. You now face a decision. Do you provide additional information that could weaken your seller's position, or do you stay aligned with your client's pricing strategy? Balancing fiduciary duty with honest dealing. As a listing agent, your primary duty is to your seller. You are obligated to act in their best interest and work towards securing the best possible terms. However, you must also deal honestly with all parties in the transaction. This is where understanding your role becomes critical. You are required to disclose material facts that affect the value of the property, but you are not required to advocate for the buyer or provide analysis that undermines your client's position. Comparable sales are generally public information. Buyers and their agents have access to that data and can perform their own analysis. Sharing that information is not typically required, and doing so without your seller's consent could conflict with your fiduciary duties. The professional agent remains honest, avoids misrepresentation, and stays aligned with the client's goals, while allowing the other party to perform their own due diligence. The story, navigating dual representation. Now imagine you are representing both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction under a limited dual representation agreement. Both parties have given informed written consent, and you are carefully managing the process. During the transaction, you are aware of market data that could influence the buyer's decision. At the same time, you know your seller's expectations and position. This is where agency becomes more complex. Working within the boundaries of dual agency, dual representation requires balance. You are no longer advocating for one side. You are facilitating a transaction between two parties with competing interests. Confidential information must remain protected, but general market information, such as comparable sales, is typically not considered confidential. Providing non-confidential information can be consistent with your obligation to act with reasonable care and deal fairly with both parties. However, the key to managing dual agency successfully is not reacting in the moment. It is setting expectations in advance. The agreement should clearly outline what can and cannot be shared, reducing the risk of conflict later in the transaction. The story: when compensation and agency collide. Now tie this back to the previous section on compensation. Imagine you are working with a buyer, but you did not clearly define your compensation or the scope of your services in writing. As you search for properties, you find one that fits perfectly, but it does not offer compensation or falls outside your expectations. Do you show the property? Do you explain the situation? Do you avoid it altogether? This is where agency and compensation intersect. Why clarity at the beginning solves problems at the end. A broker has the right to define the terms of compensation and the scope of representation. However, once an agency relationship is created, fiduciary duties apply. If those terms are not clearly defined, the client may reasonably expect full representation across all opportunities. This is exactly why the previous section emphasized written agreements. When compensation and scope are clearly outlined at the beginning, these situations become easy to navigate. When they are not, even simple decisions can create confusion or conflict. The story: after the relationship ends. Finally, imagine your listing expires, and the seller chooses another agent. During your time working together, you learned personal details about their situation, including motivation, financial pressures, and urgency. Now that the relationship has ended, you might wonder whether that information can be used or shared. Confidentiality extends beyond the agreement. One of the most important fiduciary duties, confidentiality, does not end when the agreement ends. Information shared in confidence must remain protected unless the client provides consent. This duty reflects the trust placed in you as a professional. Clients rely on agents to handle sensitive information with care, and that responsibility continues even after the relationship is over. Bringing it all together. This section builds directly on the previous chapter. First, you learn to define compensation clearly. Now, you understand the importance of defining agency just as clearly. When both are established at the beginning, everything else becomes easier. Conversations are clearer, expectations are aligned, and risks are reduced. The most successful agents do not leave these things to chance. They take control of the relationship from the very first interaction. Define your role, set expectations, communicate clearly. That is how you operate at a professional level in today's real estate market. Online discussion. Question: why should agency be defined at the same time as compensation? Answer: because both establish expectations at the beginning of the relationship and prevent confusion about duties and responsibilities. Question: what is the risk of not clearly defining agency during early conversations? Answer: the client may assume representation exists, potentially creating an implied agency relationship and legal obligations. Question: does confidentiality end when the agency relationship ends? Answer: no. Confidentiality continues even after the agency relationship has terminated.